The Awakening Chronicles, Book 2, Awakening on Main Street, Chapter 9, The Gathering Field. The first light of dawn found Joe Martinez already at work in the Meridian Café, but this morning was different. From the thousands that had come before, the familiar rhythm of grinding beans and calibrating the espresso machine carried with it a weight of anticipation that seemed to emanate not from his own consciousness, but from the space itself, as if the cafe had become aware of its evolving role in the transformation that was beginning to ripple outward through the city. Joe stood before the gleaming espresso machine, his hands moving through the preparatory ritual that had become second nature over the past few months. Now every other gesture carried conscious intention. What had once been simply the opening and routine of a small business had transformed into something approaching a ceremony, a daily recommitment to serving not just caffeine and calories, but to deeper nourishment that human beings required to remember themselves. The cafe around them had evolved as well, though the changes were subtle enough that most customers wouldn't notice them consciously. Joe arranged the seating to encourage conversation rather than isolation, positioning chairs and tables according to principles of energy flow he had learned through his awakening work. The lighting had been adjusted to support different qualities of attention through the day, softer in the early morning to ease the transition from sleep to waking consciousness, brighter during the busy midday rush to maintain clarity amid the chaos. But the most significant change was invisible to casual observation. Joe had begun to recognize Meridian Café not just as his workplace, but as a field of possibility, a space where individual awakening could catalyze collective transformation. Over the past weeks, he had noticed patterns in how different customers responded to the quality of attention he brought to their service. His phone buzzed with the messages from his 4 friends, each documenting how their individual work was beginning to create what Elena had called a network of consciousness throughout the city. Maya's voice message carried excitement. I was playing violin on the street corner near the city yesterday evening, and something incredible happened. People started gathering, not just to listen, but to participate somehow. Strangers began harmonizing, children began dancing, even the business people stopped checking their phones. Leo's message was characteristically practical, but carried deeper implications. The construction crew working on the community center has been stopping at your cafe for morning coffee this week. I've noticed the days they drink your coffee, their work is more coordinated, fewer mistakes, better calibration. It's like you're not just serving caffeine, you're serving some kind of coherence that carries into their other activities. As Joe finished his opening preparations and unlocking the front door, he felt the familiar flutter of performance anxiety that had been growing stronger each day as he became more conscious of his role. The invisible struggle that the stranger had helped him recognize had become fully visible, at least to him. Now he faced the more challenging task of learning to navigate the collective responsibility without losing the authenticity that made his individual service effective. The morning's first encounter was Mrs. Patterson, a regular who had been coming to the cafe for 3 years without Joe ever learning her first name or anything about her life beyond her coffee order. But this morning, instead of simply preparing her usual double Americano and accepting her payment with minimal interaction, Joe felt called to do something more. Mrs. Patterson, he said, as he brought her coffee to her customary corner table, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've noticed you watching the intersection every morning. Is there something specific you're looking for? The question seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure faltered, revealing something vulnerable beneath the professional mask that she typically wore. You know, she said slowly, I've been coming here for 3 years, and you're the first person to ask me that. Joe settled into the chair across from her. something he'd never done before with any customer. I realize I've been serving you coffee all this time without really seeing you. I'm trying to change that, to be more present with people who trust me with part of their day. Mrs. Patterson looked at her coffee, then back at Joe, then out the window where the morning commuters were beginning their daily pilgrimages to offices and obligations. My daughter used to live in the apartment building across the street, she said finally. She moved to Portland 2 years ago for a job, and we haven't spoken since then. Every morning I sit here hoping I'll see her walking past, even though I know she's 800 miles away. The vulnerability in her admission created immediate intimacy, the kind of authentic connection that Joe had been learning was possible when service moved beyond transaction to genuine encounter. That must be so difficult, he said, meaning it completely. Have you thought about reaching out to her? Every day, Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice carrying years of accumulated regret and hope. But I don't know what to say. How do you apologize for 3 decades of being too busy to really listen? How do you ask forgiveness for loving someone so much that you forgot to show it them? Maybe, Joe said gently, the apology isn't the starting place. Maybe you could just tell her that you've been thinking about her every morning, that you miss her presence in your life, that you'd love to hear how she's doing in Portland. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of recognition rather than sadness. You know what's funny? She said, reaching for her phone. I've been rehearsing elaborate speeches in my head, trying to find the perfect words, when maybe the simple truth is all I need. Joe watched as she typed a text message, her fingers moving slowly, but with growing certainty. When she finished, she looked up at him with an expression that he'd never seen before on her face because, well, not the careful mask of the professional competence, but something open and hopeful and fully alive. The morning rush began as it always did, but Joe approached each interaction with renewed understanding of the field of possibility that existed within the most routine exchange. Every cup of coffee became an opportunity to offer presence rather than just product. Every moment of eye contact, a chance to acknowledge the full humanity of the person standing there before him. Alina entered just as Joe was finishing Maya's drink, carrying what appeared to be a notebook full of observations. I've been documenting the consciousness patterns in different coffee shops around the city, she said, accepting the herbal tea Joe prepared for her without being asked. The readings here are unlike anything I'm seeing elsewhere. She opened her notebook, revealing charts and graphs that mapped energy patterns over time, measurements that showed clear correlations between Joe's level of presence and the collective coherence of everyone in the cafe. Look at this, she said, pointing to a spike in the readings that corresponded to his conversation with Mrs. Patterson. When authentic connection happens between two people, it affects everyone in the vicinity. The field effect is real and measurable. Leo arrived with his usual punctuality, construction dust still on his work clothes, and the satisfied expression of someone who had begun his day with meaningful labor. The crew is asking if we can have our morning meeting here tomorrow, he said as Joe handed him his Americano. They say the coffee is better, but I think it's more than that. There's something about this place that makes difficult conversations easier. By mid-morning, the cafe had become transformed into something Joe had never seen before. Not just a place where individuals consume coffee while pursuing separate agendas, but a space where authentic community was spontaneously emerging through the simple expedient of people showing up fully for their encounters with each other. Dr. Williams, a psychologist who had been coming to the cafe for morning meetings with clients, approached Joe during the brief lull. I don't know what you're doing differently, she said quietly, but my patients are having breakthrough sessions here. The therapeutic alliance forms faster. People are more willing to be vulnerable. Insights emerge more naturally. It's like the space itself is supporting healing work. Maya arrived during a lull between rush periods, carrying her violin case and a kind of radiant energy that suggested her morning practice had gone particularly well. I can feel something different in here today, she said as Joe prepared her usual cappuccino with an extra shot. It's like an entire space is humming with connection. I think I'm finally understanding what the stranger meant about invisible work becoming visible service. Joe replied, every person who comes in here is dealing with their own version of what Mrs. Patterson was carrying: isolation, regret, the fear they've forgotten how to connect authentically with people who matter to them. As the five friends settled into their familiar circle during the afternoon lull, Joe felt the weight of collective responsibility settling more fully on his shoulders. The individual awakening work that he'd been doing evolved into something larger than and more complex. He was no longer just an individual pursuing personal transformation, but someone whose development was catalyzing community formation in ways he couldn't have predicted or planned. I'm scared, Joe admitted, his vulnerability creating immediate intimacy with their circle. When it was just about my own awakening, I knew I could only mess up my own life if I got it wrong, but now I'm seeing my consciousness affects everyone who comes in here. And I don't know if I'm ready for that level of responsibility. Maya nodded with the recognition of someone who had wrestled with similar fears about her role as sound healing facilitator. I felt the same way when I realized my music could actually influence people's psychological states. But then I remembered what the stranger taught us about service. We're not responsible for controlling outcomes, only for offering our most authentic presence and trusting that consciousness knows how to use that presence for everyone's highest good. Elena leaned forward with her scientist's precision applied to the emotional territory. The measurements I've been taking suggest that authenticity creates its own safeguards. When someone is genuinely present and caring, the effects on others tend to be benevolent, even if they're not predictable. Leo's construction experience translated easily into the challenge Joe was facing. In building, you learn to trust the materials and the process even when you can't control every variable. Good craftsmanship creates conditions for success, but you have to let the work do what it wants to do within those conditions. Tariq's perspective carried his characteristic blend of lightness and depth. The fear of messing up other people's lives through your influence is just another form of taking yourself too seriously. The universe managed to evolve 4 billion years without your help. It can probably handle whatever mistakes you make while trying to serve coffee with consciousness. Their laughter dissolved, with some of Joe's anxiety, but the underlying challenge remained: how to serve community formation without losing the individual authenticity that made such service possible. Their conversation continued. Joe began to understand that this was not a problem to be solved, but a creative tension to be navigated moment by moment, day by day. What if we set up formal gatherings here, Maya suggested, not just our morning meetings, but opportunities for other people to explore what we're discovering about consciousness and community. The suggestion sparked immediate interest and concern in equal measure. Joe felt excitement at the possibility of creating intentional space for the kind of conversations and connections that were already happening organically, but also anxiety about the level of commitment and skill such facilitation would require. Elena immediately began calculating logistics. We need to think carefully about structure and facilitation. People need containers that feel safe enough for authentic sharing, but open enough to allow for genuine discovery. Leo was already envisioning the physical modifications that would support such gatherings. We could rearrange the evening seating to create more intimate configurations. Maybe add some acoustic elements that would support deeper conversation. Tariq was thinking about the psychological preparation people would need. Most folks have forgotten how to be real with each other. They'd need some ways to ease into authenticity without feeling too vulnerable too quickly. Maybe we start with humor workshops. Laughter breaks down barriers naturally. Joe felt the conversation opening territories he had never imagined exploring when he first began working at the Meridian Café. The vision they were sketching together represented everything he had hoped the cafe could become, not just a business, but a catalyst for the kind of community formation that could serve awakening on a much larger scale. What would we call it, he asked, recognizing that naming the vision would be a step toward manifesting it. The gathering field, Maya said immediately. That's what you called this place earlier, a field where people can gather, not just physically, but consciously. Joe felt something shift in his chest as the vision became more concrete, more real, more demanding of actual commitment rather than just theoretical interest. I think we have to try it, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decision, not because I'm ready for it, but because the readiness might come from doing it rather than from preparing for it. The afternoon proceeded differently after their planning session, with Joe experimenting with bringing even more conscious intention to his interactions with customers. He began to notice patterns in how different qualities of attention affected the atmosphere of the entire space, how genuine curiosity about someone's experience could dissolve the barriers between strangers, how authentic articulation for someone's presence could transform a routine transaction into meaningful encounter. Mrs. Patterson returned. She returned around 3 o'clock, her face carrying an expression Joe had never seen before. She called. She said simply, tears streaming down her cheeks. My daughter called. We talked for 2 hours. She's coming to visit next month. Joe felt deep satisfaction in recognizing that this was what the stranger had meant. Meant about becoming invisible or becoming visible service. This was what the stranger had meant about invisible work becoming visible service, not the manipulation of outcomes, but the creation of conditions where people could remember their own capacity for love, their own willingness to risk vulnerability in service of connection. As evening approached and the cafe prepared to close, Joe reflected on the day's revelations. He was no longer the same person who had awakened the morning with questions about his readiness for collective responsibility. The day had taught him that readiness was not a prerequisite for service, but a result of it, that individual authenticity became collective catalyst, not through careful planning, but through moment-by-moment willingness to show up fully for whatever was needed. The last customer of the day was someone Joe had never seen before, a woman in her 50s who ordered a simple black coffee and sat by the window looking out at the darkening street with an expression that suggested she was processing significant life transitions. Instead of beginning his closing routine, Joe brought her coffee to the table and sat across from her. I'm Joe, he said simply. I own this place. Is there anything I can do to make your evening better? The woman looked surprised, then smiled with genuine warmth. I'm Catherine. She said, I just moved to the city last week. My husband died 6 months ago, and I'm trying to figure out how to start over at 53. I've been walking around the neighborhood looking for somewhere that feels like home. Well, they talked for nearly an hour about grief and renewal, about the challenge of rebuilding identity, especially after profound loss, about the courage required to begin again when everything familiar had been stripped away. Joe offered not advice, but presence, not solutions, but the kind of listening that helped Catherine remember her own inner wisdom about navigating life's most difficult passages. When Catherine finally prepared to leave, she looked around the cafe with the same expression Mrs. Patterson had worn earlier. "This feels like home," she said. "I'll be back tomorrow, if that's all right." "It's more than all right," Joe replied. "It's exactly why this place exists." As Joe locked the door behind Catherine and began his evening cleaning routine, he carried with him the profound satisfaction of knowing he had served not just coffee, but the deeper nourishment that human beings needed to remember themselves, to remember and connect with each other, to participate consciously in the great work of awakening that was rippling throughout the city in ways too subtle to measure and too powerful to ignore. The gathering field was no longer just a metaphor, but a lived reality, a space where consciousness could reorganize itself in multiple forms simultaneously. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began planning formal community gatherings, new opportunities to explore what became possible when individual awakening was consciously directed toward collective transformation. But tonight, Joe carried with him an understanding that he had discovered his true vocation, not just a coffee shop owner, but as a steward of community formation, a facilitator of the authentic connection that made collective awakening possible. The city hummed outside his windows with its usual evening rhythms, the millions of people moving through the built environments that had been created without conscious attention to their effects on human development and awakening. But Joe and his friends were pioneering a different approach, proving it was possible to create spaces that actively supported the evolution of human consciousness. The great work was no longer just individual awakening. It was becoming a collective creation, the conscious construction of environments that would serve awakening for years to come. And Joe Martinez, community anchor and servant of human potential, was ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead in the essential work of helping consciousness recognize and serve itself through human community.